Jeff Karabanow is professor and associate director in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. He's worked with homeless populations in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Guatemala, and his research focuses mainly on housing stability, service delivery systems, trauma, and homeless youth culture. I want to say first that right now we don't even really know how many people are currently experiencing homelessness in so-called Canada. The number could be anywhere between 150,000 to 300,000 people, according to the Homeless Hub, a research center at York University. That is too wide a range. What that range says is that our system cannot see unhoused people. The tools we're using, for example, Homeless Hub is using AI now to predict that the number will swell to over 500,000 people by 2030. The tools we're using to measure and respond to the problem are fundamentally broken. One of the big themes in this conversation is the idea of vulnerability, or rawness. It's clear to anyone who's paying attention that the people who are living unhoused are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to extreme weather, to so-called deaths of despair. They're vulnerable to violence, among other forms of harassment and precarity. But the other side of vulnerability has to do with those of us who are housed and who are buffered from the serious social issues that exist right outside of our doors. Much of what Jeff does is about breaking down barriers, the visible and invisible barriers to radical social change that keep the solvable problem of homelessness in a state of perpetual disaster. We break down those barriers in this conversation, at least discursively. They include systems of policy making that exclude first voices, academic research practices that don't authentically include a community-based aspect, a kind of reticence about cultivating what Jeff calls caring, authentic spaces in a world that sometimes punishes us for trying. Engaging with everyone is really what's required to get answers pushed into place, but that means looking seriously at the hierarchies, the opaque strategies and structures of exhaustion that privilege some and punish others. It also means taking seriously the effects of our histories of colonialism and racial capitalism that are about extraction and exploitation of the land and people. I know it's a lot, but that is where the language that Jeff uses for outlining the problem becomes so valuable. At the heart of it is just this idea that actually housing is the foundation of a healthy, dignified life. As much as he gestures to the importance of being raw and real and letting emotion be an acceptable part of political communication, Jeff is also really just emphasizing the fundamental question of dignity and dignified living, which is the crux of recognizing the displacement of people onto the streets by an unfeeling system as a clear and present disaster. People shouldn't have to show their resilience the way this system makes them. People need homes, they need subsistence, they need a proliferation of spaces where a strong culture of care exists. They do not need a system that seeks to silence and sideline them. Maybe the most striking thing that Karabanow explains in this conversation is that the solutions are simple. What's complicated is the matter of building the relationships necessary to influence policy. This is why he drives home the fact that political action is crucial, collective struggle is important, making sure we're using tactics that move people is essential, because in his words, homelessness has always been a disaster. When that disaster is visible, that is the time to act with a sense of urgency. But even and especially when that disaster is invisibilized, it is still time to act with a sense of urgency. So yeah, thanks so much for speaking with me. I've learned a lot from reading your work, but it's interesting to kind of try to apply, social justice lens to this ongoing disaster, this inflection point that we're reaching now with the waves of unhoused people that are living not just here in Chibuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, but across so-called Canada. There is this crisis that won't go away. But locally, I think it's a prominent issue here because we're seeing people die. We're seeing people overdose in front of City Hall. We're seeing fires in tents, deaths related to people just trying to stay warm. And, even kind of strange controversies around people receiving free electricity as a just a kind of crisis measure. Um, but yeah, we're at a point, I think, if we wanted to track it, where CBC is reporting that Nova Scotia's first tiny village of emergency pallet shelters will be opening at Beacon House in Lower Sackville. I guess Pallet is a U.S. supplier of these so-called emergency sleeping cabins. 19 units are expected to arrive toward the end of the month, part of 200 that have been purchased. So, what struck me in reading this news was that, the shelters look a lot like the emergency shelters that were constructed by community activists that, Halifax police officers destroyed in August 2021 when they evicted unhoused people from the Peace and Friendship Park, the Halifax Common, Horseshoe Island Park, and maybe most visibly the site of the former Halifax Memorial Library. What do you think about this particular crisis measure? Is it adequate, and how should we contextualize it in the long struggle to make housing a human right?
I think that everything we do around homelessness seems to be we seems to be emergency crisis reactions. We rarely put any resources or thought to more preventative, more sustainable, more social justice platforms. So this is these pallet homes. I just did a quick little interview this morning on the pallet homes. I mean, these pallet homes, they're better than nothing.
Hmm.
You know, they provide a little bit more dignity. I've also made the comment that they are, look very similar to what, the municipality tore down for the last few years. Now we're embracing that as a particular band aid solution. Um, I mean, the context is that we're a rich country. There should be really nobody, especially in Nova Scotia, where we still have somewhat manageable populations that are visibly living rough, that we could be mobilizing to put folks into much safer, more dignified environments. So we've witnessed, you know, opening of another shelter, emergency shelter, that's going to be a collective open space. Um, we've witnessed better tents being provided. We've witnessed more kind of street navigation, outreach, connection. We've witnessed now the pallet houses that should have been here in the fall. So we consistently see last minute mobilization to provide some form of short term band aid care, because this is a very visible dynamic right now. And, you know, while there's lots of caring folks in the municipality and the province that are working day in and day out, kind of on the ground with a lot of other folks in the nonprofit community, it's something that I think is so visible that the government needs and has to kind of feel that they got to be part of it. So again, it's these kind of last minute um, um, huge announcements, and again, like it's just out of reach of when they really needed to be here.
Hmm.
We've seen that over the years as well. So it's very frustrating that folks are going to have to spend at least another month, kind of, in pretty extreme weather until these things are set up.
Hmm. Yeah, and I find it interesting to think about your perspectives on the social policy changes, the kind of proactive stuff that would address the growing number of people experiencing homelessness, alongside other writing on the subject, right? So there are people who point out that municipalities in many ways are on the front lines, like land use, zoning laws, housing approvals, like those are important things, as tools to just encourage if affordable housing. People like Jerusalem Demsis writing for the Atlantic saying that, quote, when we have a dire shortage of affordable housing, it's all but guaranteed that a certain number of people will become homeless.
Right.
But like you're clear about the need, certainly for like what you call local responsiveness. And yet you've also admitted that we're playing catch up and it's going to get worse before it gets better. You said that in an interview, I think last year. So I'm wondering, first of all, what you meant. If it, needs to get worse before it gets better, like that's the logic, which is striking considering it's already really bad. Or if it's about your sense of how complex like multi-level governance is in a rich country like Canada.
Mhm.
Like how do we mobilize all of the players to
Right.
more urgently address the issue of homelessness at its root?
Right. That's a really nice question. I, I definitely meant more the latter. That I mean,
Mm,
it's going to get worse before it gets better. A lot of it due to the fact that we are playing massive catch up after 30 odd years of disinvestment in any form of affordable community housing application. So we've got that as a major, major context. Secondly, it always seems like there's a lot of advocacy around a mobilization in early fall to warn both the municipality and the province that things are going to become more dire. Shelters are all full. There's not enough affordable housing. Housing support workers are feeling extremely frustrated. Outreach workers are very worried around, just the health of folks that are living rough. And again, there's a lot of back and forth. It's the systems make it very complex. I think homelessness,
hmm
is a pretty simple dynamic in the sense of, if you could find some form of housing infrastructure that's safe and healthy, then you don't have the issue anymore. You have other dynamics that need to be at play as well to support folks that are exiting the street. But the fact of being unhoused kind of can be eradicated pretty quickly. But to navigate the different layers of government, the different systems that are at play, the more and more I'm starting to learn the complexity of bylaws, of zoning, of
hmm
how the interplay between different housing systems at the municipal and the provincial level make things really overwhelming and takes a lot of time. Like we've also, I sit on a committee where we are connected to the Reaching Home funding, that's federal funding for homelessness. And even trying to navigate the money that comes at the federal level, that we have the jurisdiction to kind of work with all the nonprofits to figure out what can be the next play. It takes it just it's overwhelming how long and what is the labor to even like purchase something and get it on market and get it set up for folks that are in dire need. So I'm kind of, I've become humbled in realizing just how complicated that side of housing can be. I mean, I like my experience is we just keep bugging until
mm
finally somebody gives up and they give us something that can be a sustainable spot for folks. And we've done that in the past. But, now with just the amount of folks that are living in encampments, we need something that's more coordinated. And we're seeing that. I mean, again, there's going to be, there's discussion right now around, and by the time this probably airs, we'll have more of an understanding. But there could be a purchase of a hotel or something that
mm.
allows for a little bit more sustainable adventure to get folks off the streets.
Yeah, like this is the thing. There is no question really that we're in desperate need of just an adequate supply of like affordable housing and just more robust or like faster movement toward more robust spaces for people to live. And that like I think it's also pretty clear to folks that the private housing market alone is just not going to provide that.
No,
Do you think we're kind of missing something, though, if we do only approach it as a housing issue? Like thinking specifically about Halifax, if our goal is to have everyone currently living in tents to be housed indoors, like is supply the only barrier? Should we be considering, things like mental health and substance use alongside the lack of housing as reasons for why, we have so many people in encampments?
Yeah, I'm definitely, those are considerations. My sense and my
Mhm.
research and my practice, um, and it may be my own dogma here, but I always feel that finding that sense of stability and belonging is so huge in really understanding then the other dynamics like mental health, like addiction, like employment, like education, that are kind of the the entities that can build better connection to civil society for a lot of folks that feel extremely marginalized right now. We're amazed that every time we kind of house folks over the years, that is the better understanding of then where they are in terms of physical, emotional, psychological health. You've got to first give somebody some form of stability to really then gain a baseline of what is it that they need to, to be able to kind of be part of civil society once again. There's a lot of trauma, on the streets prior to street culture as they exist and survive on the streets, and even exiting is can be very overwhelming. Once you kind of get that baseline down, once you can provide some form of housing stability, then I think with the individual, we can really work on what the next stages are like. And it's very rare that folks can't actually kind of move forward and stay off the streets after they've actually had, been part of selecting, choosing, finding a space and making it their own. And,
Mhm.
a more dignified, a more participatory style of engagement in the world then is actually extremely pivotal to one's sense of self. So
Mhm.
yes, there's a lot of, we're hearing a lot about a lot of addiction dynamics, a lot of mental health in these encampments. That's really not surprising. I mean, street life is extremely violent, extremely dangerous. Homelessness is a disaster. It's dangerous, period.
Mhm.
So you're getting folks that are living in particular communities. Those communities at some point kind of move away from that collective sense of belonging and care. And it's still, I mean, there's still those elements there, but also people are like are in really rough spots. And there's a lot of exploitation on the streets as well, as we all know. So
Mhm.
kind of, I always think like, like the better sense is if we can find some form of like platform of stability, then with the individual or with even kind of a collective of folks that have exited, we could kind of figure out what next steps are like. My work in
Mhm.
Montreal, I think, really, really highlighted. And I talked a lot about kind of the sense of, you know, critical consciousness that surfaces once somebody has their basic needs met and can kind of start to see themselves vis-a-vis the structural elements in their worlds. And that
Yeah.
comes, of course, with time and with stability.
Yeah, I mean that really resonates for me. Like that is something that I took away from reading a lot of your research, especially, of course, on young people experiencing homelessness and what the transition out of and then back into and then out of again maybe feels like in terms of stability and like sense of self. But you've got this one short essay that I wanted to point to where you actually reflect on living through the pandemic as a social work professor, and you talk about how, to quote you, everyone deserves the same opportunities to be safe, healthy, and protected. And like what comes through in a way is this just core value of like obviously social justice, anti-oppression, kind of equality, liberation from that like grinding fragility that our economic system produces and kind of runs on in some ways.
Absolutely.
Um, like that word fragility comes up a few times in your
Yeah.
work. And I wondered why some of what you're working through hinges on that feeling of fragility and like fighting fragility. Um, and I guess, like, more specifically, what kind of community you hope for in the face of that fragility.
You know, I think one thing over just my years of work, I was honored to be working with a lot of different communities that were experiencing homelessness in a variety of different locations. And there is a what really struck me is there's a there's a deep, deep sense of precarity of not feeling like you fit in anywhere. And I think fragility, my sense, the language of fragility is that the more you sit in these marginal spaces, the more you understand your environment's messaging that you don't belong and
Mm.
you're not worthy. This sense of fragility becomes a ingrained marker in your mental health, in your spiritual health, in your psychological health, in your emotional well-being. Like this notion of fragility is, even if you can capture one basic need today, like you have a tent for the night at least, and you know that, the storm is abiding, you can stay there for the night. There's still so much of a sense of precarity, of you so much is not meted out for you, that there is that consistent anxiety of how you're going to survive. And that comes very, very clear to me in working with a lot of folks that are experiencing homelessness. And I guess my sense is that having that foundation of some form of healthy, dignified living space is a way to start to kind of break down a sense of fragility. It
Mm.
allows for a sense of, feeling human again. I remember we followed young people who were exiting the streets in Toronto, Montreal, and actually no, sorry, this was a different study where we were following young people exiting the streets across Canada, and so many spoke about the first day they woke up in their own space was so important to them feeling human again. And that has always very much resonated. This idea that these are communities that appear almost kind of angry at the world. And there's so much of a rationale for why they are so angry, but the more I've connected with them, the more I've realized how insecure their whole existence is. And again, like, that's why, like, just the sense of being able to provide some form of dignified living is a beginning of building a sense of solidity in your world. It's not the panacea. And I've,
Right.
argued I'm actually moving much more towards buying into kind of a guaranteed annual income, a basic income, as maybe the way to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Housing is important, definitely, 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 in so many different ways. But to also be able to be human again, folks need to be engaged in a number of different elements, and a guaranteed basic income could possibly provide that.
Yeah, no, I think like absolutely. And there's broad support. Like there's tons of public support for that. It shouldn't
And a
be
lot of good
seen
evidence.
it shouldn't be seen as radical.
Nope, not at
And
all.
it's like interesting, how you describe this kind of this moment of feeling like almost yeah, like exhilarated, reassured by like the feeling of stability reminds me of the documentary Dark Days, right? This film by Mark Singer from like 2000 about people living in like Amtrak tunnels, in underground abandoned subway tunnels. This invisibilizing of the unhoused underground, and like what it meant to come out of the out of like literally the ground, out of the shadows and into the light. Like the film concludes with that moment, and it's unbelievably cathartic. Not, obviously for the people depicted, but like for you as a viewer to see what that transformation must feel like. And they go certainly from a position of like anger, hostility, and avowing their hustle
Yeah,
against like society's rejection of them and the violence done to them on the streets, to accepting this comfort that they had sort of, yeah, rejected out of a kind of necessity. But
yeah,
I wanted to kind of pick up on something you said about like fragility, and relate it to like this sense that I think we're increasingly getting, that like we might not think of people who are sleeping rough or who are displaced as like refugees, right? They're a different category. But like when wildfires hit us here in Mi'kma'ki this year, last year rather, suddenly it was clear that like we have climate refugees here, that like
Abs-
as sea level rise looms we're going to have more. And I think like that feeling of precarity and fragility is becoming more of like an everyday experience. We sometimes call it like eco anxiety or climate
yeah.
anxiety. We're going to have more
Yes.
internally displaced people, as you said. Like it might get worse before it gets better, and if we just wait and don't adapt, the consequences are going to be very severe. And yet, like adopting that future-oriented perspective seems to be a real leap, especially for people in like places of
Right.
political power that have to worry about like
Of
elections.
course.
And this is
Absolutely.
something you've spoken about really well. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that. I saw you in a recent news broadcast talking about this, right? Like the just the logic of electoral cycles and spending being in some ways a deterrent to that future oriented way of doing policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, just before that, like your point, like made me think also of, you know, we started to have a better sense of that whole notion of, kind of disaster reality when COVID hit us. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I think our last kind of academic social science humanities research council funded study kind of, I wanted to explore how, homelessness has always been a disaster, but it was never seen as a disaster. The pandemic was seen as a disaster. So I kind of wanted to merge like one lens of disaster to another, to start to allow kind of, well, policymakers in particular, but also the public to understand that we should be always considering the fact that somebody living unhoused, as like you're saying, like as actually a,
Mm.
some, like, I don't like the term refugee, but like the idea of they're in a disaster space, and we
Right.
need to have some form of dynamic that, the municipal or provincial elements can provide some form of support, just like we did with the wildfires, right? There
Yeah.
was very
Yeah.
engaged, very strategic plan
Totally.
to support folks, and that's important, and that's needed. We need to also employ those strategies to other disasters. And this consistent disaster is around homelessness, which we're seeing for the first time now. I think the public is really buying into the notion now that, yeah, you know what? This is actually something is actually off, and we need to be thinking through how we can provide basic needs to all citizens. And we're starting to see more and more homelessness as part of our communities and as part of our citizenship. The idea of, kind of the political environment, it's really frustrating because, like, there's so many great folks in the political arena in our province that have deep, deep care and understanding and commitment to trying to figure out the homeless crisis and the housing crisis. Um, and I find it so frustrating when they share how their hands are tied, that
Mm-hmm.
there's so little that they can do, that once they kind of mobilize a particular initiative up the levels, up the chain of command, that it tends to kind of be thrown out,
Mm.
because there's not that vision, there's not that preventative mechanism of understanding that these are issues that are going to plague us for a long time, and we can also be arguing this as a cost benefit measure as well, just like a
Totally.
guaranteed annual income. Is that we can try to argue in the language of kind of, our capitalist environment, that these things are going to save us money in the future.
Mm-hmm.
If the idea of saving lives is not enough. So I think we need to. I mean, I think the reason I've moved a lot to art based dissemination is for, much easier, more tangible engagement of policymakers to talk about these dynamics. I'm doing a talk actually for policymakers in 2 weeks, and I'm using something the mayor actually our mayor has said that was the first thing that when he said, like, when I think of youth homelessness, I think about this animated piece you've done,
Hmm.
and it kind of hits me in a raw way that other things haven't. And I think, for me at least, I think I have had more success in trying to disseminate particular ideas or initiatives through art than anything else. And
Hmm.
um, I think maybe this is a time. I may be a bit optimistic, but I think this is maybe a time where politicians are more apt to listening, because it has just become uh, just consistent news around housing and homelessness. And,
Yeah.
my worry is that they're starting to conflate, increase in newcomers and immigration as the kind of major fault axis of why we're seeing a housing shortage now, when really, that is it happens to be it's happening at the same time, how that we're having increased populations. But
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can, we can actually see the decrease in engagement and investment in public and community housing over the
Hmm.
past 30 years, and how that's impacted us compared to, for example, Montreal, where there was less of a disengagement, or in Vancouver, where there's been less of a disengagement.
Yeah, I share that kind of concern with what I see as kind of like this right populist search
Mhm.
for just kind of like these easy,
He's
expedient answers, right?
Yeah,
And it's dangerous. Like we really, Naomi Klein's new book Doppelganger is about how we actually really have to pay attention to the appeal of those kinds of easy baked kind of answers to really complex problems. But yeah, I
absolutely.
mean, there's tons in what you just said in terms of like how infrastructure determines our exposure to disasters, that in some ways these natural disasters even are not particularly natural. They're really like socially engineered disasters, like in terms of their costs anyway.
Yeah,
But yeah, I'm really interested in um, arts based strategies for kind of displacing the discourse from just like standard dry academic policy based things that clearly have not worked because things have not changed as much as they needed to. You've written that, for example, street cultures can be sites of excitement, belonging, and acceptance, as well as exploitation, violence, and stress. They're not just one thing. And I think like that gets to the heart in some ways of the value of a more like nuanced arts-based strategy, right? You've got this reductionist stigma directed at people who are unhoused that is especially inhumane. But arts-based methods, especially that come from those people,
right.
can be useful for undoing that stigma and like recuperating the obvious humanity of those that find themselves on the streets. Um,
Yeah,
did you want to talk more about like what you discovered in the uses of art for this purpose? I mean, you've written that art can also allow us to convey emotion and engender empathy in ways that research just can't. Um, where did you kind of discover that, and how did it change your approach to, studying and addressing this problem?
hmm hmm Um, I think my first relationship with art bait work was being in Guatemala, with United Nations, working around street youth dynamics. And the only reason we did a film was a colleague of mine that I brought with me was a filmmaker. So we started to dabble in kind of using film as a way to broadcast what we were seeing, as well as allow the voices of the young people we're working with to have a place to vocalize their experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I left Guatemala and I was back in Montreal and we were in the editing rooms, I also realized that it was a deep it was an avenue to connect deeply with our participants in a way that um, kind of more traditional research methodologies um, possibly can't. And the reflection on the relationships that I built as we moved throughout the months of working on a film allowed me to see, I think, in a much deeper way, the kind of nuance and complex nature of this phenomenon that I was exploring. And then moving it to kind of when I moved to Halifax, I had some funds to do an art-based camp for young people on the streets. And that was also, it was a way to kind of, I thought it was just a way that we could share some of the skill sets of art to young people if they were interested, and kind of speak to a whole bunch of different elements of kind of their worlds. It ended up being actually a beautiful community building exercise where we we kind of were allowed to show kind of a raw sense of self, all of us, and
Mm-hmm.
be able to, I think, yeah, be able to share kind of who we really are, and at the same time celebrate the deep connections we were making, and be vulnerable and raw at the same time. And we all went through that, and it's amazing because I kind of thought I was just going to set this up and I was going to then try to have some time with my children, but then I end up my children coming into this circle, and all of us kind of being able to go through particular things. And that was actually my first time of really, really understanding kind of, like you said, the nuances of, things, things can be, um, things can be more than simply one-sided dynamics. That
Mm-hmm.
there can be contradictions. There can be deep messiness to phenomenon, allowing for the kind of emotive elements to
Mm-hmm.
surface was pretty important to me. It also, we're all learning a skill set. We're all kind of building our own critical consciousness as we learn the processes of doing art. So in a way, there's a couple different processes emerging at the same time, which I think is very, very powerful and deeply human in
Mm-hmm.
in in its way of. We all kind of were learning about art. We all were attempting to message a particular understanding or understandings, and at the same time, the there was kind of a synergistic element as well, that we almost there's a bit of a cathartic,
Mm-hmm.
deeper epiphany understanding that surfaces in when you're doing kind of authentic art.
I find more and more academics like to use the word rich to describe this or that thing. Like that was a very rich response. That was a very
Mm,
rich paper. But I'll use it here. That was like an incredibly rich response. And I kind of want to kind of, emphasize the one word you use, which is raw. Like
mhm,
that idea of rawness is really rich because, like, what, for example, would be the other side of like that binary? Like what is the opposite of raw? It's sort of like clean, abstract. When we think of raw, we think of like a raw nerve, right?
mm.
So the opposite of it would be something like unfeeling or invulnerable, something contained, right?
Yeah.
And you're describing something that is like the other side of that, that allows us to experience emotion, to be moved, to be real, and to be vulnerable.
At least for me, when I
Mm-hmm.
read academic verse, it there is a separation between the reader and the writer usually. We try not to have that space in kind of the work that we produce. That there is something that I showed it at a guaranteed basic income conference, and in the afternoon, first voice folks were speaking, and
Mm-hmm.
it so touched me that a few of the first voice folks were saying, like, that was me, like in that animated piece that Jeff showed earlier, that was me. And the way that we could capture those particular experiences in a real raw way is, to me, like the biggest compliment. I'm
Mm-hmm.
always worried because I also sit outside of this whole world as well. So for me to kind of have the last kind of say in the portrait of this is it's daunting, and that's
Mm-hmm.
why I think like engaging as many participants in every product is really important for me.
Yeah, what comes to mind is I saw a short film recently at Halifax Central Library, called, I think, Rising from the Ashes, about the creation of a community hub in Montreal during COVID. And, there's one reflection from a woman that had just, fought cancer, that language of fighting cancer, survived cancer, where she says, like, if you're depressed, help someone. Like, just the simplicity of a statement like that is so powerful,
Mm.
because it's not simple. It's actually like deeply, deeply complex. It's just stated simply. And I think that's what sometimes academics forget, is that, stating things simply, it doesn't mean that it's simplistic.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
and I wondered if you wanted to talk about your work within the Dalhousie School of Social Work Community Clinic. I mean, your chapter on this was really striking to me. You talk about how that clinic is really meant to operate like a bridge between the worlds of community and university.
Yeah.
That work of moving between worlds is like such a theme in your work,
Yeah.
and here you're looking at your own site of work and saying that, what we're trying to do is be a bridge. How does the clinic kind of set out to do that, and maybe especially how does it do it by, as you write in that chapter, resisting Western notions of individualism and power over?
Right. Right. Um, I think the clinic is probably the best example of a culmination of the work that I've done in the community over the past 20 years. Um, and I'll just focus on two particular. One was Dalhousie in Montreal, which was a really unique kind of alternative styled youth shelter for folks experiencing homelessness, and it was set up with young people at kind of the helm of every layer of intervention, that they would be able to speak to what is truly needed from their perspective. And it was the first time that I ever did something like that, and it again, the whole messiness and the complexity of working with a whole bunch of different voices to kind of build something was really amazing and really kind of changed the way I think about community development.
Hmm.
Uh, then moved towards Out of the Cold, which was kind of a non-profit, or on the ground, it wasn't even nonprofit, on the ground, um, uh, uh, service delivery. It was an emergency overnight shelter in the winter, so it was about 6 7 months every year, that was set up all by a vast amount of volunteers and a few staff, if we could ever find money. And but we once we started to solidify a little bit more resources, we kind of had at least a little more consistency around some staffing. But for the vast majority, it was folks that were just interested and caring about homelessness, that would be part of our circle. And to me, that was extremely educational around, that we were leaving behind kind of the academic theories and the academic um, languaging of social problem, and moving to a deeply heartfelt, um, non-professionalized space to provide some form of sanctuary. And I think that really kind of um, I think what it did was it solidified my kind of view of a lot of professions. That
Mm-hmm.
what we really, really need, what we're lacking in civil society these days, are these really caring, authentic spaces that kind of can be built on a non-hierarchical model. And so turn to the kind of Dallas Social Community Clinic that was kind of developed by myself and Cindy Hall, the field practicums coordinator at our school. Um, we we really wanted to build a community. First, we wanted to build something in the community that could speak to the various um, gaps that we were seeing in service delivery. We both kind of came from community, so we were kind of lucky that we had already a vision. We did some consultation, but really we kind of said, let's just try this out and see kind of how it flies. And if it doesn't work, the community will tell us right away and we can close down. Um, so the idea of the clinic, which we don't even know the name. I wish we didn't call it clinic, but called it just a community hub or something like that, was to, you know, I guess, and I sorry, just before I continue on the evolution, um, what was really important about this community clinic for me was uh, trying to see the university world as meaningful to a variety of different settings, right? Like, right, university has definitely a place in kind of middle class environments, in the business worlds, in the educational landscapes. I'm not quite sure where it sits with general
Mm-hmm.
communities that are experiencing all the suffering that goes along with this kind of capitalist world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And the more and more I worked in community, especially now the cold, like I had colleagues, like I was the only person who actually had a foot in academia. Everybody else was in nonprofit. They used to always bug me saying, like, like, oh, forget Dow, come work with us, come work at the North End Community Clinic. There's a position open, come do that. And I was like,
Right.
do you know I actually work at a university? Like, I'm time. This is like doing this on, side of my desk. And so
Mm-hmm.
clinic was for me something that could, I think, allow the university a meaningful space in impoverished communities. So that was kind of that's where my heart and Cindy's heart was. Along that, we wanted to have something that, our theories in social work are like, attempting to understand intervention from a anti-oppressive, a social justice. For me, I did a lot of research in Latin America and work in Latin America, that accompaniment movement, that kind of, we work alongside one another. We kind of, we hold each other's hands as we fight for kind of the injustices that, that are in front of us. So all those elements were very important in becoming also a training ground for those in the health professions that are going to be providing these supports to folks down the road. And there's very few community spaces that actually, you know, allow for a very interprofessional. We have like occupational therapy, psychology, social work, um, nutrition, nursing. We're working on a nurse practitioner right now. Like all these different
Mm-hmm.
elements that can work together to provide holistic care with the client or the participant at the center. So it was really meaningful for us to be able to kind of move the theories that we speak about, that we know has a lot of evidence around them, to kind of a particular platform where we can test them out and see if it's working or not. And
Yeah.
we've been. I was just at the clinic, and I would, if you asked me how long we've been, how long we've been around, I'd be like 7 years. They just told me it's 10 years, and we have to celebrate 10 years.
That's
This
amazing.
Yeah, so like 10 years that we've been doing this, and it's so lovely because I was just sitting around the table with all new students in social work and occupational therapy. But today, those are the two disciplines with us, and yeah, every term we see different students. Um, I love the fact that I can also work with folks. Like we work with guests. I've been trained in a lot of EMDR, so I'm kind of doing some EMDR work. So we do. It's so something that is like deeply trauma sensitive, trauma informed. It's low barrier. It provides kind of support to those who reach out to us. There's very little rules or regulations to kind of what we do. We're a niche to folks that need something, that aren't getting it in their worlds right now. And what we see is we kind of have become branded as, a service for those that are, experiencing poverty, living in very precarious environments, not on the streets or in shelters, but there has been a lot of NGOs that have been set up for those groups. So we're kind of one out. We kind of try to do a lot of prevention work to keep people at least somewhat safe and somewhat housed as we work on all the other different elements. So we do kind of the wraparound supports for a lot of
Mhm.
folks.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there is a role, it sounds like, you're saying for the university. It's just a matter of being like self-critical about what that role should
yeah,
be. And it reminded me of, there's this book from Fernwood that's called What Moves Us. It's just like an edited anthology by Alex Kishnabish and Max Haven, where like the intro, I think, talks about how like really it's about kind of they say disabusing ourselves of these kind of illusions we have as academics. They say like really our use of resources often is like unjust. It's a it's a misallocation of resources. and
absolutely.
and they actually refer to what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call study, right? Which is this notion of like, and I'm quoting them, the collective empowerment and joy that comes from the repossession of the university's literal and metaphorical resources in the name of movements and communities. It sounds like that in some ways is what the clinic is
Yeah,
about. So
exactly.
it's like it's got a role, but it's about trying to make the boundaries of the university kind of more porous and shifting and attentive, responsible. Um, you
Absolutely. I
know,
mean,
yeah,
it holds such privilege. It
hmm
has such resource, engagement and such currency in our environment. So it has to
totally.
be kind of exploited to support everybody in society, not just a particular segment.
Totally. I totally agree. And like your work in like actually going out and engaging with, as you say, first voices is about that. And I definitely want to ask you about like the huge amount of time you've spent engaging with young people who are living on the streets. We really didn't kind of dig into this. I found that research really enlightening. This idea that there are very specific aspects of the youth experience of homelessness that need to be attended to was just not something I had thought about. You talk about how the opportunity for experimentation and identity exploration that's like such a part of being young gets curtailed by processes outside of their control. This idea that youth who do not take on street value systems and norms find it more difficult to survive on the street, while youth who become part of street subcultures might experience a better quality of life when they're on the street, but then have difficulty like integrating into mainstream social life. It's like maybe that's sort of intuitive, but your research really reinforces it in this like vivid way. And so I'm wondering about how your work with so many different young people, right? Like it's not one homogeneous group. Helped you think about like these tensions between different social worlds, different classes, different cultures, and if you could kind of offer listeners, viewers as well, a general sense of like how being homeless and young brings into focus like the specific politics of dwelling in and claiming like public spaces that are in many ways policed
Yeah,
and really reserved for things other than everyday life.
absolutely. Absolutely. And again, very eloquently spoken to. Um, yeah, I mean, I write that one thing we have to understand, and this was with young people, but it applies to everybody kind of living unhoused right now, is that when you're experiencing homelessness, you are living your private world in very, very public spaces.
Yeah.
And that has a huge impact on your sense of identity and sense of self. The fact that every small element of being human kind of gets surveilled and can be a target of criminalization, uh, you know, pushes folks to who are living in unhoused spaces to a particular kind of othering that we don't see in other aspects of
Mm-hmm.
of social phenomena. The dynamics of kind of street world. I mean, I feel extremely honored that there were times in my life where I spent a good amount of time with young people experiencing homelessness, that I was allowed to enter those spaces either through my work in practice or as a kind of ethnographer. And I think there was a time in my world where I was actually very good also at just building relationships with kind of the youth world, um, because I was young myself too. So
Hmm.
that I think is very important as a in that connection. Um, it
Yeah, just
is.
ethically, right? Yeah.
I've got to say that in there, even when there's so many times where people be like, "Okay, what are you here for?" I'm like, "I'm actually here for nothing."
Right.
Even that film camp, I'm like, we can do, yeah, just if there's anything you're interested, like, I've worked with your organizations that kind of have referred, you to me. If there's anything you want to do, or we don't have to do anything. And it took some time to build that relationship, but I think the fact that there's nothing that we were asking of them, but
Hmm.
to kind of have a space to just dialogue, I think was really, really important. I think also like my work in Guatemala, my work in Toronto, Montreal with young people in the streets has allowed for, I think, a very candid and kind of authentic lens into just the nuance and complexity of I mean anybody's world, but in particular I was interested in young people's worlds, and to just to see kind of the rituals and the ceremonies of street life, and to be able to kind of take that as important rules and structures of the day to day is, I think, something that honors that world. And I think
Hmm.
we need to, like, I mean, I had a lot of appreciation for the structures and regulations of how you lived on the streets, how you were able to survive, what your day to day looked like, that I think, you know, was important in also carving out the interventions that are important when you need to escape those worlds and you need to kind of gain a healthier, more sanctuary of living so that you can kind of move on. I think it was important. And I think you can't forget the context of that. This is also um, adolescence. And
Hmm.
there is a deep, deep realm of exploration and adventure, of um, bravado, of um, kind of seeking that is important in exploring, as they kind of live their lives day in and day out in very precarious environments. That there is something about kind of that youth culture that is also very, very important, that we don't speak about in other populations.
Yeah, no, I thought that that work was really unique because like it sort of models a way of seeing too, you know?
Mhm.
It says that like we can see differences without othering, right? Like we
Right.
can see others empathetically. And young people especially kind of probably internalize that feeling of like the gaze of the other, especially the gaze of the adults, seeing these rituals being one of like automatic condemnation. Um,
Right.
and so like it's not enough really to just make visible these things. Like there's no ignoring the presence of encampments in the center of our city, right?
Right.
And yet the ways that we see them differ from person to person. And like this is something that you've definitely written a lot about in relationship to COVID-19 and like the ways that the pandemic made certain things visible. It's interesting to see you say, for example, that you feel like that greater visibility has led to more empathy. Like I think that's true, but there still seems to be a desire among some parts of the political class maybe, or the middle and upper classes, I don't know, to just make homelessness less visible, as though like that's the way to solve the problem, to just push it to the periphery. But like what does hiding homelessness achieve from your perspective, and how did COVID, for example, shed light on the issue in ways that have changed us irrevocably maybe?
So there's always been folks that have been living rough, that have been living
Hmm.
um, in particular encampments. and have been known to particular communities or to outreach workers, to government folks. There seemed to be less interest from a collective stance on their well-being. There was always interest when we were close to having a hurricane or when there was a particular climate disaster that that's the time where government would turn to folks like us who had deeper relationships with particular encampments to see if there is a way that they can be protected through this crisis. I think there's always, I mean, I think government cares when they need to care for, you know, folks that kind of are situated outside their constituency. I think what COVID did was I think it has a much more collective stance of empathy in terms of everybody touched a level of suffering through this collective disaster. Nobody walked away unscathed. So there was an the sense of othering was lessened at that
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, as we kind of entered the kind of post-COVID stages, some folks could get back to a normal way of living or a way of living that resembled pre-COVID, while a greater population didn't. A
Mm-hmm.
greater population kind of came out with deeper consequences of that disaster. So seeing the rise of a population that is blatantly and obviously suffering, right? You don't live in a tent if you have any other means of survival. That kind of basis of suffering, I think, has touched a greater population because everybody was kind of has already a bit of a feeling of or a layer of suffering from what they've gone through. So I think that was an easier bridge of understanding. There's good and bad to that, as you note. There's good that it's more visible, so we kind of feel it. Um, but also, we then start to see, and this is kind of circular to our beginning of our discussion, then you kind of get pressure, government gets pressure to do something. And a lot of times what they do is they want to just kind of get it outside of the public gaze, right? They just want to kind of move it. So you start to see, the formation of another shelter, or you see a formation right now of the pallet house. These are things that are like band-aids on band-aids that will demonstrate that they're doing something at one level, but then kind of, we can then start to critique the population if they don't go to these particular interventions that the government has
Mm-hmm.
set up. So again, it's going to mess it up, and I bet in a few months there'll be less sympathy for this population because there's a sense that okay, the government has set up a lot of these interventions now. Why are there still people that live in encampments? Again, missing the larger points of housing instability, trauma, and just a sense of marginalization.
Yeah, no, like it's that kind of seductiveness of simple answers, and it's more comfortable to kind of, dwell in that space of individual responsibility. It's just like it's an easier narrative in a lot of ways. But, you know,
Absolutely.
what I found really potent and like clear in that CCPA report that you co-authored on homelessness during the pandemic is that focus on how addressing homelessness is actually about holding ourselves responsible for historic wrongs that like recur and persist into the present. Racism, discrimination, colonialism. A group of authors wrote last year in the Tyee that as part of their reconciliation journeys, municipalities must streamline the creation of Indigenous housing that's not only affordable, but culturally safe and trauma-informed, with wraparound services to support healthy home lives, prevent homelessness, and help Indigenous families heal and reconnect. This is, I think, where the language that you're using heads us toward is like that specific model of radical care that is radical because it looks at the roots.
Right.
And it sounds like all of your work and community has really reaffirmed that sort of fact of it really all being rooted in some ways in care. Um, like that's a more durable force than just the kind of reactive model of visibility or invisibility being the ultimate determinant, like optics being the ultimate
Yeah.
baseline question. It's like, it's about more than optics, right? It's about allowing people the conditions under which they can like flourish in the world. That seems to be a lot of the
Right.
main thrust of what you're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's about, like you said, like authentic, radical support and care. It's about deep, deep compassion for a lot of wrongdoings in our culture. And you absolutely, definitely, you definitely need a historical lens, and we need to be mobilizing all together to provide the particular care for populations that have been completely ignored and violated over generations. We seem to have a few kind of organizations in the community that have been tasked now with making sure that that continues, that we actually have some form of sustainability in terms of indigenous styles of housing and African Nova Scotian community housing that we never saw. Like we
Mm-hmm.
this is new. This is all new now, and that's another piece that has surfaced outside of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for just giving us a way to kind of see a future of material hope in a lot of ways when it comes to this. Like, obviously, in a lot of ways, very intractable issue, as you said. Like this disaster existed before the disasters we're seeing one on
Right.
top of another now, and it's not like there's no way around it. You have to go through it.
Right.
So, yeah, I appreciate you talking to me today.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And again, like your eloquence and your commentary is beautiful.
I appreciate that.